Hello, everybody. A couple of weeks ago, we did a interesting show with Tanya Gold, a Anglo-Jewish writer who wrote a piece called "My Auschwitz Vacation," or an essay about Holocaust tourism for Harper's Magazine. It was an interesting conversation. She thought she wanted her piece to be titled Her Gay Romp Through Jewish Poland. It's a rather satirical piece and in its own way angry about the way in which the German Holocaust, the persecution of Jews, the death of many millions of Jews has been turned into a kind of commodity, particularly in Poland. People go to Auschwitz wearing headphones and treating it as if it's Disneyland. Gold's piece came to mind for me when I heard about a new book called Two Wheels to Freedom, the story of a young Jew, wartime resistance, and a daring escape. It's a uplifting book by my guest Arthur Magida, but I wonder whether Arthur, there's a danger when you write these kind of books about glamorizing Jewish resistance, heroic Jewish resistance to the Nazis,
Mhm.
that you are Disneyfying the struggle, given that these were isolated incidents and the vast majority of Jews in Europe died at the hands of Nazis.
Okay, first of all, there's nothing glamorized about my book, nor Disney-ified. I'd like to go back for a moment to what you just said about Auschwitz. Your comments regarding that were actually some of the concerns about the Holocaust Museum in Washington when that was in the works, let's say 15, 25 years ago. People were concerned that that was going to become a tourist attraction, and kids would go there in Bermuda shorts. Everybody would have cameras. They would smile. They would snap each other's photo, and everybody would go home happy. People did not go home happy from the Holocaust. Excuse me, from the Holocaust Museum, and I have a hard time believing that anybody goes happy from visiting Auschwitz. I have not been to Auschwitz. I've been to Buchenwald. I've been to Dachau. I do not wish to go to another concentration camp. My book, Two Wheels to Freedom, uh, story of a young Jew, wartime resistance, and a daring escape, tells the story of an absolutely unique individual, Sioma Schonhaus. Nothing Disneyfied about it. Yes, he was courageous. Yes, many, many, many Jews were not courageous, many gypsies, many homosexuals also. This guy, Sioma, stands out because his parents were taken to quote camps in 1942. He went into hiding shortly after that. He'd been trained as an art student. He was heroic because he used his art skills to make fake IDs for several hundred other Jews who were hiding, and he saved their lives that way. In the meantime, Sioma was living as normal a life as he could, even though he was hiding. He had many, many girlfriends. He went to hotels. Actually, he sat just a few tables away from some fairly high-level Nazis. He bought a sailboat, even though he never sailed before. He finally, in 1943, he bought a excuse me, he bought a bicycle because he realized that the Gestapo was closing in on him, and he spent 4.5 weeks biking from Berlin down to Switzerland through deepest, darkest Nazi Germany, 600 miles. He was stopped once, and that was by a very young, almost teenage soldier who wanted to see his ID. Since Sioma was a master forger, that young soldier could not gauge that he was looking at a fake document. So there's nothing Disneyfied about this fellow. What is unique is his courage, is his imagination, is his craftiness, is his ability to sustain his high spirits throughout all the time he's hiding. And then when he got into Switzerland, he was not happy. And actually, the Swiss weren't too happy either because they were getting very tired of all these people coming over their border. By the end of the war, they turned 27,000 Jews back to Switzerland. Sioma was not turned back because back in Berlin, Christian friends of his who opposed the Nazi regime had given him the phone number and the name of the most prominent Protestant theologian in the world at that point, Karl Barth. Sioma went through several days of interrogations by the Swiss police. He was finally fed up and he said, I'm going back to Germany if you're going to continue to treat me like this. The Swiss took some umbrage at that. Sioma handed them the phone number of Karl Barth. Barth intervened on Sioma's behalf, and Sioma spent the rest of his life as a good, productive, happy citizen of Switzerland. Nothing Disneyfied about this. Unique, yes. And the other side of the story of
There is. I
Jews
take
going
your
equally,
point.
yes.
I take your point, Arthur, in a sense, maybe rather than Disneyfied. Actually, when Gold went to Krakow, she noted that there was an Oscar Schindler quality. Maybe it's Schindlerification of the Nazi experience. But so maybe I introduced it slightly wrong. So the main character in your book is this fellow called Sioma Schonhaus, certainly a remarkable figure, a great hero. You noted earlier that he was unusual amongst European Jews. What distinguished him? Why was he so different? Was there something braver about him, something smarter, something luckier?
He was way more stubborn than many, many other people. He was way more clever than other people, partly because of his training as an artist, partly because of his very innate nature to be clever and to be stubborn. And he also had inherited his mother's sense of optimism, and that conveyed her to conduct herself with as much dignity as she could. He inherited his father's stubbornness. Sioma was very aware of what the Nazis were doing, and he literally begged his father to leave Germany. His father said no. His father had been in Russia, then moved to Berlin, then moved with his young family to Palestine in the mid 1920s, and finally back to Berlin because Sioma needed medical care that he was not going to get in Palestine. As Sioma is begging his father to leave, his father, Boris, says, no, you don't make the same mistake 3 times. Russia, Berlin, Palestine, back to Berlin. So Sioma inherited all these qualities, and he was very, very nimble. He was very quick to think when he was riding on that bicycle, September 43 to early October 43. Sometimes he would make up stories about himself. Sometimes he would charm young ladies who had their eye on him, and all the time he knew that his photo was in every police station in Germany. He was one of the most wanted men in Germany at that point, and yet he kept biking, and he was glib with those who asked him who he was, and he conveyed himself with great dignity and great courage.
What were his politics, Arthur? We did a show a couple of weeks ago with the Le Monde correspondent in Washington, D.C., Piotr Smolar. He's just got a new book out, actually a very impressive book called Bad Jew, about his grandfather, a family's quest from the Minsk ghetto to Netanyahu's Israel. His grandfather had been a member of the Comintern, a Polish communist, but also fought with remarkable valor in the Minsk ghetto. Was your hero Sioma Schonhaus? What were his politics? Did he flirt with communism, Zionism, or was he indifferent to politics?
Well, both of his parents were socialists. When he was in his teens, his mother signed him up for a youth group. When I interviewed Sioma a number of years ago, he told me this youth group was so far left wing it was almost communist. But that's what it wasn't. It was also very, very pro-Palestinian, pro-Zionist, not the kind of Zionism we're witnessing now, but his youth group was determined to convey socialism throughout the world and also convey Jews to the land of Palestine and create a state that mutually benefited Jews and the Palestinians who were already living there. So you referred to this fellow whose grandfather, I believe, was a communist. Um, Silma wasn't that far left wing, but he certainly was very
Smolar. And,
liberal.
and what about the issue of violence? Piotr Smola's grandfather was a very brave man. He fought in the Minsk ghetto, the resistance to the Nazis, and actually
Mhm.
survived. Did your hero Tsioma Schoenhaus, was he a violent man? Did he sometimes have to kill Nazis?
Nope, nope. He never had a gun. He never had a knife. He never strangled anybody. In fact, he was opposed. He wasn't a pacifist. What he was opposed to violence as much as he could. In fact, when he was preparing to bike from Berlin down to Switzerland, first of all, friends said he was crazy. Nobody had ever done that. A friend offered Sioma his pistol. He said, "Look, when you get close to the border, carry this with you. If a soldier comes up to you, shoot him." Sioma refused to take the gun. He did not want to injure anybody at all in his pursuit for freedom. So no
Why though?
violence.
I mean, we did a show. We've done a lot of these shows, as you can tell,
Mhm,
Arthur. It's a particular. There are a lot of books about it. It's a particular
mhm.
interest for me. We did a show. I'm sure you're familiar with the author Judy Battalion. Her
Yes.
book, "The Lights of Day: The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos," is
Mhm,
about women who fought against the Nazis.
mhm.
Why
Right.
didn't your hero Tsioma just become a guerrilla fighter against Nazism and try and kill
Mm,
as many of these evil people as he could?
mm. Well, first of all, he was never given the opportunity to become a guerrilla fighter. In Berlin itself, there were no guerrilla fighters. He did not want to use violence because he didn't want to succumb to the same level as the Nazis. To him, violence was a tool of despicable people. Even if you're shooting others to protect your own violence, your family, your people, he maintained his distance from that. And there were many people. My previous book, in fact, was about a Sufi heroine who was a spy for the British in Nazi-occupied Paris.
Yeah,
She
it's an
also,
interesting book. It's called Codenamed Madeline, a Sufi
yeah,
spy in Nazi-occupied Paris. What's your view,
yes,
Arthur, on this? Some people might argue that that this sort of non-violent approach to
mhm,
a group of people who were killing millions of Jews is slightly absurd.
mm. Uh, I tend to agree with you. When you're confronted by the kind of horrors and savagery and bestiality that the Nazis uh, conducted themselves in. When you are confronted with that kind of inhumanity, certainly one route is to be violent, even if it means you're being almost as violent as those people. Personally, I doubt if I could ever kill anybody. And I would rather not convey that possibility in my own mind. I'm not a pacifist, but I do not like violence. And nor also, and her father, who brought Sufism to the West in 1910, they were not outright pacifists, but they wanted to remain as peaceful as they could. Nor did Sioma did. Lots of others did. Everybody in Sioma's anti-Nazi cell in Berlin did as well. And not once did they succumb to violence. Not once did they ever hurt anybody. And still, they saved almost 1,000 people with
So tell
their
me more
endeavors.
about this. I mentioned Oscar Schindler, Schindler's List, of course, a book and a
Mhm,
movie about a non-Jew who saved many thousands of Jews.
mhm.
The hero of your book, Two Wheels to Freedom, Sioma Schoenhaus, how did he save Jews?
With, with his pen. Um, The other people in his anti-Nazi group, it was called the Kaufman Circle, w- would obtain official IDs. People had lost them, people had donated them because they knew what this group was up to. They were then given to Sioma. He was able to swap photos from IDs that had been issued to
Mm.
Jews, put them in these other IDs. He learned how to camouflage his own handwriting so he could be traced down. And in these other IDs, he would put the names of a pseudonym for the Jew who was going to receive it. So he was self-trained as a counterfeiter, and he was in the end the best faker of IDs in the entire city of Berlin.
How did he achieve this within Berlin itself, given that this was obviously the heart of Nazi Europe?
Yeah, what astounds me about Sioma and amuses me so much about him is that I at least had thought that somebody who's going to hide from Nazis, especially in Berlin, would lay low as much as possible. Sioma, I'm convinced, tried to live as, quote, normal a life of a 20-year-old as he could. As I said earlier, he went to restaurants, he went to bars, he would walk up and down the streets. Of course, he did not wear his Jewish star, but that was before he knew
Well,
that the
that goes
Gestapo was.
without saying. I mean, did he have the qualities of a tightrope walker? Did he somehow enjoy danger?
I think he enjoyed, in a sense, taunting the Nazis because, of course, he knew who he was. He also learned how to get around checkpoints. He knew how to signal to other people in the anti-Nazi cell that there was danger. These were people who cooperated with each other immensely, who loved and cherished each other immensely, and were devoted to each other and to their cause immensely.
I mean, it all sounds very romantic, but meanwhile, the Nazis were exterminating almost all of European Jewry. How did he think of his own historical relevance, significance?
Mhm.
Did he? You said he understood what was going on, but did he really understand the mass murder of Jews in the East and in the concentration camps?
Mhm. Well, probably late spring 1942, a soldier who had been in Poland took Sioma aside and showed Sioma photos he had taken in Poland of emaciated dead bodies, of smokestacks pouring black ash. And Sioma intuited that these were Jews, and the Jewish population of Poland, many of the Jewish population of Germany were being trained there and killed and exterminated, going up the smokestacks. There was little way that anybody could have a grasp of the Nazis' crime because it was so vast. It was beyond comprehension. But he knew people were being killed. And he warned his mother when he got home after seeing those photos. And she said, "No, Sioma, the
How
Nazis
was
can
his
do."
mother living in? His mother, as a Jew, was living in Berlin.
Yes.
How was that?
Well, just one sec. His mother heard from Sioma what he'd seen, and his mother said, "No, Sioma, the Nazis can do many things, but they cannot stop the sun from shining." An example of his mother's optimism, and not once did that wane. She was living in Germany in a neighborhood surrounded by other Jews, and yes, they would see the Jewish population of their neighborhood, Mita, eroding and fading 10 by 10, 20 by 20. Everybody knew that somebody was going somewhere. But the Nazis were very clever, and they told people they were going to a better life, they were going to another future, they were maybe going to a labor camp, and they were going to work industriously for the Reich. And people were in denial. It was beyond comprehension to consider what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
think
there
it
was,
goes beyond. You call his mother an optimist. Sounds to me like she was a fantasist. There were still 65,000 Jews left, I think, in Berlin in 1942.
yeah,
What was the fate of his mother? Weren't all those Jews eventually killed, one way or the other?
Not quite. Yes, 65,000 Jews. Goebbels was getting angry. 42 or so, he decided he's going to cleanse all Berlin from Jews, and he got roughly 56,000 out. 8,500 or so remained in Berlin in hiding. 2,000, 2,500 of those survived the war. His mother saw no need to hide. She believed, and you could call her a fantasist. She believed
Sorry, say
what
that again. She believed in what?
she believed what the Nazis told her.
But was
Yes,
she
and
walking around Berlin with a Jewish star?
yes, his mother, excuse me, was very obedient. His father was very obedient. He, of course, was not. He was cocky. He was happy-go-lucky. And he thought he could get away with just about anything, and indeed he did. And they were
How many
very
Jews, Arthur, were like, at least in your mind, Sioma's parents, who were walking around Berlin even in 1943, 1944, with Jewish stars on their arms, living
oh,
openly as Jews?
well, by 1944, nobody was wearing a Jewish star. If you were hiding, you kept that star off, and just about everybody else had been sent off to camps, a word I intensely dislike. But most of them, let's
Why
say
do you
until,
dislike that word?
oh, because it resonates with summer camp. These
Yeah, but
people
we all
were
know
not
what the
sent,
word means, right? I mean, it's a
I'm sorry.
concentration camp.
And there we go again. Yes, we're habituated to use the word camp. We're habituated to use the word transports. These were not, freight trains for human beings. These people were treated like cattle, and these camps, as we now know, were extermination centers. The word camp, I think, has been
Okay, I
has been
take your point. So,
sterilized.
I take your point, Arthur. What was the fate then of his parents?
Well, they were taken, quote, to the east, and within a month, his father was killed. Shortly after that, his
Mhm.
mother was killed. And just
So they were killed.
before,
They were victims of the Holocaust.
yes, and they went up those smokestacks, same
And Selma
smokestacks.
was the one who managed to escape. You noted earlier, Arthur, you've written Codename Madeline, a Sufi spy in Nazi-occupied Paris, about
Mhm.
the daughter Nur Inayat Khan, the daughter of an Indian Sufi mystic. You've also written a book called The Nazi Seance, the strange story of the Jewish psychic in Hitler's circle. What is it about this subject that interests you as a sort of popular nonfiction writer?
I've been trying to figure that out. I believe that I felt there was a hole in my life. I was born in 1945. Nobody in my family ever spoke about the Holocaust. I went to Hebrew school. We learned about Abraham in the Bible smashing his father's idols. We didn't learn a single thing about 1933 to 1945. Once, when I was a kid in the Bronx, I remember seeing somebody walking down the street with numbers on his arm. I looked at my parents. Nobody explained to me. Nobody until I was maybe in my early 20s.
Isn't
That
that a little odd? I mean, for a
I'm
Jewish
sorry.
family in New York not to know about the Holocaust, and for your parents to not tell you what happened.
Looking back, yes. Looking back, also, though, I believe everybody was so traumatized, everybody was so confused, and the entire world was confused that they did not know what to make of this. And to tell a little boy, and I was one back then, what had occurred, even to attempt not to be specific, they probably felt would be too shattering to this boy. And I have friends who had the same kind of
Yeah, I can understand
non-exposure.
Arthur not telling a 6
Yes,
or 7-year-old, but you said you didn't
yeah.
learn about it until your early 20s.
Well, it continued to be a matter of shame to the Jewish community at large,
That it
not just to my.
happened, that the Jews allowed themselves to be murdered.
Well, be careful with that, please. Jews have
Well,
never allowed
you
themselves
use
to
the
be
word
murdered.
shame, so I was just curious what that means.
Uh, People were ashamed because the the world had not come to their rescue. Perhaps there was something deficient about them. They were ashamed because in this country that they cherish, Germany, and it was their home for quite a while, and in other countries in Europe, their neighbors turned on them, their friends turned on them. And it became a matter of self-examination after a while, as well as examining those who were around them. Why us? And that's still a question. Why
We did a
us?
show also. You're probably familiar with the writer George Gilder. He's a well-known tech writer, also a big supporter of Israel. He's not actually Jewish, but he has a new book out, The Israel Test: How Israel's Genius Enriches and Challenges the World. And he argues in this book and in our conversation that, and I'm quoting from the thing about the book, that Israel's stunning rise as a world capitalist and technological power stems in part from the Jewish culture of mind and in part from Judaism itself, which encourages intellectual curiosity and rational analysis. Was there something about your hero, Sioma Schoenhaus, that sort of conformed to this idea of Jewish innovation? And that's Gilder's term, not mine. Or could Sioma Schoenhaus have been anything? Could have been a Muslim, a Christian, a non-believer. It just, he happened to be a heroic figure.
His parents, to some degree, were non-believers. In the end of his own life, he became a complete non-believer as well. And he blamed, this is, I find very ironic, he blamed Judaism for his parents' death. If they were Jewish,
say that again?
He blamed Judaism for his parents' death. He told
Why?
me, if exactly why, and I asked him that very explicitly. He told me if his parents had not been Jews, they wouldn't have been killed. So blame the faith, not the killers.
Isn't that rather odd, though? I mean, how much time did you spend with him?
Oh, almost a week. This was a number of years ago, just before I did my book, Codename Madeline. I'd learned about him. I was fascinated with him. I followed by car the route he'd taken on bike from Berlin down to Switzerland, and then I spent almost a week with him at his home, just outside of Basel, and he was a charming fellow. But frankly, the sort of questions you're asking regarding him, I think would have eluded him to some extent. I didn't find him to be a very introspective person. Not to say he was superficial, but I don't think he ever really immersed himself in Jewish history, in Jewish philosophy, in Jewish theology. He was a kid, 1920, when all this was going on, and once he got down to Switzerland, he created a life for himself. He had a wife, another wife. He had 4 children, and I think he wanted to put this behind him as much as he could.
I wonder whether that lack of introspection that you very, I think, eloquently articulated might be something that helped him in this heroic resistance, this remarkable resistance to Nazi Germany. Do you think someone a little bit more introspective, a bit more sort of philosophical, one way or the other, might have struggled more?
That's an excellent point. Thank you. And I not to denigrate Sioma, but I think you're right. He actually he did not, as I said before, did not know much about Jewish history. And in a munitions factory where he worked, another Jew, maybe 10, 15 years older than him, took him under his wing, and he began to teach Sioma about the Jewish religion, about Jewish history, about anti-Semitism, and how that evolved. But on his own, I don't think Sioma would have taken the initiative to do that.
Has he been, I have to admit, and I'm not a historian of this, that I wasn't familiar with him before. Is he acknowledged as a hero? I mean, is there stuff? I was in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem a few years ago. I don't remember coming across anything about him. Is the Israeli state, have they awarded him their medals for people who heroes who resisted Nazi Germany. He was a Jew, of course. He wasn't a
Yeah,
Gentile. But
yeah.
how much is known about this guy?
Well, my book is my book is what's known about him. But generally, when they're talking about Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Jerusalem, or the Holocaust number of Holocaust museums in the United States, nobody, as far as I know,
Why though? It
honors
seems
honors Sioma in any way, and partly because he's so little known. A friend of mine was discussing this book with me recently, and she works at the Holocaust Museum. She never heard of him before. Um, uh, it's a remarkable unknown story, and we need more unknown stories to be known.
Arthur, some people might be listening to this and thinking this guy was, he had some odd views on Jews and why his parents were killed by the Nazis. He
Mhm.
was a counterfeiter. Is it a possibility that he invented this story? How much proof do we actually have? Because many people told many lies in this period, and there isn't a lot of proof left in the chaos of war.
Yes, the fog of war can destroy history and create memories that have no bearing in reality. I have a copy of the only remaining fake ID that he made. I have the testimony of people whose lives he saved. I have my own encounters with him. I have testimony, transcripts of interviews he gave with the German historians 1988, 89. I know of at least 3 people who were in that anti-Nazi group with Sioma in Berlin, all Christians. They verify Sioma's story. So it's not some wild psychedelic fantasy. This was truth, and this was reality, and this is a little known reality. And I would like it brought to the fore through this conversation, through my book, because we need to know there are many sides to the Holocaust, many sides to the Jewish experience during the Holocaust.
Well, not that many. I mean, most people, as you've acknowledged, didn't get away with what
Mm,
he
mm,
got away with. It really is a remarkable story. I was doing some research before this interview, and I know there was a piece in the Times of Israel about him, about a movie being made.
mm.
Tell us about this movie. Is this anything to do with you? And the title of the Times of Israel piece is "How a Young Jewish Man with a Talent for Forgery Hid in Plain Sight in World War II Berlin."
The headline is true. There was a young Jewish man who hid in plain sight.
Who
That
was
has nothing to
Kiyomer, of
nothing.
course.
Yeah, I think the film is called The Forger. Not like a movie made out of mine. I haven't seen the film. A few friends have. A few historians have. Actually, one of Sioma's son has. I refuse to see it. I understand much is invented for the movie because it's a movie. Some of the most fascinating aspects of Sioma's life are absent from the film. Nothing about him buying a sailboat, teaching him how to sail. Nothing about him biking 600 miles over 4 weeks. And somebody who's familiar with the movie told me it must have been extremely low budget because they did not have the money to see it through to its fruition. Um, I'll let other people see the film, and I hope someday somebody will come
Or
forward and
perhaps
want to make.
someone will make a. I mean, I know sometimes some of your books have been made into movies. Maybe Two Wheels
Yeah,
to Freedom be made into a movie. Did he,
yeah.
in your conversations with him, Arthur, did he think of himself as a hero? I mean, many of the bravest
Mhm.
people who stood up to the Nazis didn't think of themselves as heroes. Did he?
Mm, He knew because he had a great imagination. Not that he invented his story, but he knew he had lived a great story. And he enjoyed telling that to visitors to his home in Switzerland. One of his sons told me there would be many visitors over many years, and Sioma would tell everybody the story about what he did after the year. And finally, people stopped visiting, and poor Sioma was so lonely. And then I popped out of nowhere, and I told him I wanted to do this book, and he was happy, and we did the interview. I don't think he thought of himself as a hero. I think he thought that he had lived a unique and special and redemptive life. And through him, his parents were living. And every day he told me when he was living in Switzerland, he would think about his parents. And his parents came up, of course, during my interview with him, and he cried. And
I can
I,
imagine. Was he ambivalent about living in Switzerland? I mean, the Swiss don't exactly have a great record when it comes to saving the Jews. Did he ever
no,
consider going to live in Israel, for example, or the United States?
no, no to both. He he created a life for himself in Switzerland. He was happy. He had a profession. He was a graphic artist. He was raising a family. His father didn't want to uproot himself from Germany. You make three mistakes, you don't do anymore. Sioma had not made a mistake, and he wanted to remain exactly where he was. He did, and in fact, the entire family had a chance to move to the United States in the late 1930s. Some of the Schoenhaus's relatives were living in Jersey City, directly across from New York City. And again, Sioma's father refused to move. So Sioma was happy in the Switzerland, and actually not too far from where Sioma lived, one of his friends from that anti-Nazi cell also lived. So he had a life that nourished him, a life that sustained him in
If
Switzerland.
do you think if he'd shown up in the US, what might his story have been? Sounds like he had the skills to become a very successful criminal or perhaps entrepreneur.
I, I don't think he would have wanted to become a criminal in the US. He loved art. He loved the graphic arts. He would have perhaps created another graphic design studio for himself in the New York metropolitan area. He would have been happy. And from a distance, let's say he got here in 37, 38, 39, he would have learned about the Holocaust that was happening 8,000
He may
miles
have
away.
signed. Do you think he would have signed up for the US Army, fought the
That,
Nazis?
yeah, and there's that as well. And a lot of refugees did. We know that that's another aspect of this fellow. There's so much he could have done, and there's so much he did do in his own way, in his own, to me at least, almost magical way, without having to come to the U.S. And he
So
was able to
Arthur,
sink.
you've researched this book, you've written about it. As I said, you've already written a couple of books, Codename Madeline,
Mhm.
The Nazi Seance. You also wrote a book
Mm.
called The Rabbi and the Hitman, A True
Yeah.
Tale of Murder, Passion, and Shattered Faith. What were the lessons you learned from writing this book, this nonfiction book? We did a show a couple of years ago with a novelist, Christian Beck, who argued that World War II remains so seductive for novelists because it enables them to write very easily about
Mhm.
good and evil. She had a book out called The Winter Orphans. What kind of moral education did you get from researching and writing this book?
Mm. Okay, well, for me, both Two Wills to Freedom and my previous book, Codename Madeline, the one about the Sufi spy, blend into each other when it comes to moral lessons. Sioma, as I said before, wasn't quite interested in morality. He was interested just in the act of saving people. But both these individuals, Noor and Sioma, conducted themselves with remarkable courage in the face of remarkable evil and remarkable oppression. And that is what all of us, especially these days, have to do. He was able to
What do you
save
mean? I
people.
mean, we're not living in Nazi Germany now.
No
People aren't
one,
being put into gas ovens, are
no,
they?
no, and I'm always very careful about that because certain people equate certain individuals with Nazis or with Hitler. No, but we are leaning in a certain political direction that is extraordinarily jarring and dangerous. And those of us who believe that this is a pivotal moment in the history of this country, this is a pivotal moment in the history of the world, need to be as active as we can be and speak out courageously if necessary. Speak out against evil and bigotry and nonsense. And perhaps then we will able to steer this country in a better and finer and more civilized direction. That's
Arthur,
one.
if Donald Trump is elected in November and he does what he says he's going to do, which is round up millions of what he calls illegal immigrants, do you think that the model of Sioma Schoenhaus is a relevant one for Americans who might produce, who have his artistic skill in forging documents, who might be inspired to produce documents to enable these people to stay in this country?
Yes, and thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful transition. Sioma would be a model, but not just faking documents. Resistance can take many forms. Resistance in Nazi Berlin and throughout the entire Nazi Empire took many forms. It wasn't just faking IDs, and it wasn't just helping other people who were determined to end the Nazi regime. Simply putting food aside in a secretive place for a Jew who you knew was hiding could be a form of resistance. Letting a Jew reside in a shed in your backyard was a form of resistance. Anything that stopped the cause of death was resistance. And should Trump be elected, anything we can do to stop what you referred to would be a form of resistance. Lying down in front of trucks or trains, taking those people to camps because Trump is, I use that word, I wish I hadn't, to facilities for these individuals could be a form of resistance. We must cease allowing injustice to occur. Sioma, in his 20-year-old way, attempted to seize and stop injustice and violence and death and murder.
Finally, Arthur, we did a show a couple of weeks ago, a very distinguished English historian, Richard J. Evans. He's perhaps the world's leading authority historian on Hitler and the Third Reich. His new book is Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. And the book, in some controversial ways, actually talks about how ordinary many of Hitler's senior lieutenants were. Your book on Sioma, Two Wheels, deals with resistance rather than the Nazis. But did the writing or research of this book teach you anything about what drove the evil of Nazism, whether it was Hitler as senior lieutenants or just ordinary Germans?
Let's stay with the ordinary Germans for a moment, because I deliberately stayed away from the upper echelons. What I found fascinating was that in some ways, people, hiding or not, Jewish or not, attempted to live their lives as normally as they could. People told jokes, even though jokes were outlawed. People kept pigs and chickens on their balconies because there wasn't enough food in the ration coupons that they wanted. Ordinary people were frightened, and I've often thought, and this may sound like heresy, that ordinary Germans in Berlin had it harder than ordinary British in London during the war. At least the British were free. At least the British were not spied upon by the equivalent in England of the Gestapo. In Berlin, everybody snitched on everybody else, and you had to beware. Nobody could relax. Sioma may have been one of the most relaxed people in Berlin because he was innately relaxed and he was enjoying himself. So many other people were not enjoying themselves, and it was a difficult existence. Ordinary people also did not know where to turn and did not know what to make of what was befalling their countrymen whom they had once thought so highly of.
Well, Arthur Magida, the author of Two Wheels to Freedom, congratulations on the new book. I was thinking of taking a cycling trip to Switzerland, actually, with my wife, but now we've talked about your book and I've read some of the book. I'm not sure I'm so keen on it, but it's an important book, a remarkable story, almost unbelievable, except that it's true, perhaps the most remarkable stories are true. Congratulations, Arthur, on the book, on bringing this to the
Thank you.
attention of everyone, and for your very humane approach to this catastrophe in human history. Thank you so much, and I look forward to having you on the show. You're not going to do another book on Nazis, are you? Or
No,
Jewish
no,
resistance?
no.
I think enough is enough for the moment, isn't it?
Exactly. I quasi-jokingly say this is the last in my Nazi trilogy. I've had it with Nazis. I like Germany. I love the current generation of Germans, except those who are on the far, far right wing. My next book, which I've yet to propose to my agents, will be a complete